Have you ever really stopped to think about why we wash our hands? Or why your milk is pasteurized? Well, the answer comes from toppling a scientific idea that was treated as absolute fact for over 2,000 years. So let's dive into the story of how we discovered the invisible world all around us. For almost all of human history, it was just common sense that life could, well, just appear out of nowhere. This wasn't some fringe theory, you guys. This was a core belief laid out by Aristotle himself. The idea was that living things could just spontaneously pop into existence from non-living stuff, and people saw it as totally normal. And the examples they believed in were kind of wild. It was common knowledge that fleas just came from dust. If you wanted to make some mice, no problem. A physician back in the 17th century actually published a recipe: just throw a dirty cloth in with some wheat. Maggots, of course, were born from rotting meat. Some people even thought that snakes could generate from the marrow of a human spine. It sounds completely nuts to us, but for 2 millennia, this was the science.
But the great thing about science is that it's all about questioning. And sooner or later, even the most rock-solid beliefs get put to the test. So in the 17th century, the first real cracks in this whole spontaneous generation idea finally started to show up.
Okay, but just think about that for a minute. When an idea is so deeply ingrained that it's just how the world works, how do you even begin to test it? Where do you start when what you're questioning is basically common sense itself?
Well, the first big challenge came from an Italian doctor named Francesco Redi. He decided he was going to tackle one of the most classic examples: maggots magically appearing on rotting meat. And his approach? It was absolutely brilliant in how simple it was.
All right, so here's what he did. First, in one jar, he just left some meat out in the open. Flies landed on it, and pretty soon, maggots appeared. No surprise there. For the second jar, he sealed it up tight. No flies could get in, and guess what? No maggots. But his critics could just say, well, you cut off the fresh air that life needs to generate. So this third jar was the real genius move. He covered it with a fine gauze. Flies were still attracted to the smell, and they landed on top of the gauze. And that is exactly where the maggots appeared, on the gauze, not on the meat down below. The conclusion was just impossible to ignore. Maggots didn't come from meat. They hatched from the tiny, invisible eggs that flies laid. Life had to come from other life. Now, Redi's experiment was a huge hit against spontaneous generation for things you could see. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot, because with the invention of the microscope, we discovered a whole new world of tiny creatures, and a lot of scientists figured, okay, well, these things are simple enough to just pop into existence. So the final showdown, the main event, wouldn't happen for almost another 200 years, and it would be led by the legendary French chemist Louis Pasteur. The battleground for this final fight? It was something surprisingly common: fermentation.
So at the time, the big-shot chemists believed that fermentation, the thing that turns grape juice into wine, was just a simple chemical process, pure decay. But Pasteur came along and said, no, it's a biological process. It's caused by tiny living things, microorganisms, that are eating the sugar. This really set the stage for a major scientific brawl.
And this was Pasteur's ultimate challenge, right? If these little microbes are floating around everywhere, in the dust, in the air, how on earth could you prove that they weren't just spontaneously appearing inside a nutrient broth? And he needed to design an experiment that could let the air in, but somehow keep those pesky microbes out. And his solution was the absolutely ingenious swan neck flask. So here's how it worked. He put some nutrient broth in the flask and boiled it. That killed any microbes already inside. Then, as it cooled, fresh air was drawn back into the flask. And this is the beautiful part, that long S-shaped curve trapped any dust or microbes floating in the air. So for step 4, the broth just sat there, perfectly clear and sterile. For months, even years, life did not appear. But then, for the big finale, he tilted the flask. As you see here, this let the clear broth wash down into that bend, picking up all the trapped microbes. And the result? Bam! The broth almost immediately turned cloudy, teeming with life.
It was checkmate. The conclusion was undeniable. Life, even the tiniest microscopic life, only comes from pre-existing life. The theory of spontaneous generation, a pillar of biology for 2,000 years, was finally, officially defeated. The new rule was, all cells come from cells. Now, disproving an old idea is a huge deal. But what Pasteur's work did next was maybe even more revolutionary. It gave birth to a whole new way of seeing the world.
the germ theory of disease. Pasteur's logic here was so simple and so powerful. He thought, hey, if these tiny microbes can spoil wine and beer, what if they can spoil us too? And that was the core of his germ theory, the radical idea that many diseases are actually caused by these invisible little invaders.
And you can just see the dominoes fall in his work. It all started with fermentation back in '57. Then, by 1865, he used that knowledge to figure out that a specific microbe was behind a disease that was wiping out France's silkworm industry. And by the 1870s, he proved that the deadly disease anthrax in animals was also caused by a specific type of bacterium. One by one, he was linking a single microbe to a single disease. Okay, so this created a whole new problem. If you want to prove that one specific germ causes a disease, you have to be able to isolate it, right? You got to separate it from the thousands of other microbes it's mixed with. You need to grow it all by itself in what's called a pure culture. And this is where Pasteur's greatest rival, a German doctor named Robert Koch, comes into the picture. You could say that if Pasteur was the big idea guy, the visionary, then Koch was the master technician who built the tools they needed for this brand new science of microbiology. And one of the biggest innovations to come out of Koch's lab was this, the streak plate method. It's such a simple, elegant idea. You take a sample that's just swarming with different microbes, and you drag it back and forth across a nutrient gel. With each streak, you spread them out thinner and thinner until you've dropped off single individual cells. And when you let it grow, each one of those single cells explodes into a visible colony, a perfect pure culture.
And of course, other brilliant techniques were developed too, like the pour plate and the spread plate. But they all had the exact same crucial goal, to take that chaotic, invisible mess of microbes and separate it into pure, individual species that you could actually study. So now, with these tools in hand, the world was about to be turned upside down. The ability to actually isolate and study specific germs unleashed a tidal wave of innovation in medicine and public health. Innovations we completely rely on every single day.
I mean, just think about the results. Pasteurization, that gentle heating process that keeps our milk from making us sick, that comes directly from this work. Surgery became infinitely safer once we understood that invisible germs cause infections. Pasteur himself used weakened germs to create vaccines for deadly diseases like anthrax and rabies. The entire modern world of public health, clean water, sanitation systems, even just washing your hands, it is all built on this foundation.
So yeah, this is so much more than a history lesson. The fight that Pasteur and Koch and Reddy fought has a direct line to your life, right now, today. Their discoveries are what keep you safe in a hospital, what make your food safe to eat, and what created the vaccines that protect us from so many diseases. You know, Pasteur's famous quote, "Chance favors the prepared mind," just sums this whole story up perfectly. None of these breakthroughs were just lucky guesses. They were the result of painstaking work, brilliant experiments, and having a mind that was prepared to question an idea that had stood for 2,000 years. And that really leaves us with one last big question. This whole scientific revolution happened because a few people were brave enough to challenge what everybody else knew was true. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What ideas that we take for granted today will be the spontaneous generation of tomorrow?